a good idea to record the outcomes. And in doing so, just quickly jumping to a quick précis of what we are going to be looking at. Yes, probably get rid of those things. There we go. And in doing that, highlight, because it's not easier to see it in presentation mode. There we go. So, for the benefit of the BCSD members, you will see this in your weekly update, but this is our intelligence report or our BCSDA tracker on the INC negotiations. And what I thought it'd be good to do is just give you a quick update on the global developments that have happened since the last time we conversed, which was the 29th of April to today. In particular, what's been going on in Australia, because there has been a lot of work, and Chris is a very good exemplar of what has been going on, and we'd love to hear further about that. We also are excited that Hannah Scott-Evans from Colgate-Palmolive has joined us, and in a truly international first, we have John Duncan from WWF out of South Africa, but in a leadership role with the Business Coalition for the Plastics Treaty, is joining us today to give us a truly international feel. And with any luck, Lisa McLean will suddenly remember that she's supposed to dial in from Circular Australia. But hope springs eternal, Andrew. So after we hear about Australian developments, I was going to give you my thoughts on what were the unresolved issues, and then what might happen, and then we'll move straight to some Q&A with our dear friends in the panel. So let's think through what is going to be happening at this particular COP. Well, pre-COP is probably the better way of putting it, Andrew. And in that regard, the interesting issue is that it is, in one sense, fragmenting quite quickly since we last met. There's been some high points, some low points, some definite no points that I wanted to really call out. And the first was that only a few weeks ago at the Oceans Conference in Nice, there was this, and I wrote it down as the NICE wake-up call, but it's the Nice wake-up call declaration, which was entered into in June, where over 90 countries, including Australia, signed this joint ministerial declaration urging for a legally binding plastics treaty. Now, it called on three particular demands. The first was a cap on virgin plastic production. The second on life cycle regulation from extraction through to disposal. And the third was phase out of toxic additives and polymers. Now, that was quite important until what happened perhaps the week after, I think it was, or the week after that, where the United States administration, the Trump administration, indicated that it was formally announcing that it would not support the global plastics production limits, and that rather it advocated instead for voluntary national action plans, which unsurprisingly aligns with the oil-producing states of Saudi Arabia and Russia. Then at about the same time as the Nice conference, or the Nice Declaration, the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis published a report finding that the current draft treaty would have minimal to almost no impact unless it included binding production and trade controls. So we're getting the guardrails of what it looks like or potentially could be, success or otherwise, in relation to these negotiations. We then saw, I think it was a week ago, the intervention of Greenpeace and other NGOs urging Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, who are traditionally known as the BRICS these days, to take a lead on treaty ambition. And it'd be interesting to hear from John if there's been any developments in relation to that. We also saw the European Union and the United Kingdom almost separately forge ahead, indicating that they would be bringing forward independent regulation. In the EU's case, it was advancing its packaging and packaging waste regulations with bans and recyclability mandates. And then the UK has indicated that it is implementing the plastics packaging tax and the deposit return scheme. Now, where have you heard that expression before? That's exactly right, in Australia. Speaking of which, Australia, particularly since May, has done some really interesting and I think important contributions to the progress of the treaty. Firstly, I think this happened almost immediately after the federal election. The Australian government reaffirmed its commitment to a strong global plastics treaty by signing the Nice wake-up call, which I think positions Australia alongside the High Ambition Coalition, which former Minister Plibersek had already committed to, which seeks an upstream regulation, life cycle data, and toxic phase-out. So very much those 3 points made earlier. In terms of federal policy activity, we have seen the Department of Climate Change and Energy, the Environment and Water undertake policy consultations in relation to EPR schemes nationally, and Chris will speak to that shortly. Also, the conversation around mandatory recycled content targets for 2030. Again, Chris will speak to that. And other really interesting developments in relation to global partnerships on plastic pollution and marine litter, which the government is working with the University of New South Wales in relation to a tracker on plastics data. So that's quite important. And at the same time, and in conjunction with its ongoing dialogue with Pacific leaders on the hoped for announcement around Australia with the Pacific Islands hosting COP31, Australia has extended its technical and financial assistance to Pacific Island countries, enabling their active participation in the Plastics Treaty implementation, monitoring, and regional governance design. So they've put some hard dollars, but also some capacity building into Pacific Islands in relation to that. Insofar as government agency, industry, and subnational momentum, it is very true to say that the Australian Packaging Covenant has been hosting a national forum on business readiness for packaging reform and plastics treaty compliance, with a lot of stakeholder or cross-sector stakeholder input, which Chris will no doubt speak to in more detail. The CSIRO, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, released a circular economy roadmap addressing plastics, glass, paper and tyres. Only 10 years too late, but we'll move on. The roadmap offers strategies apparently for waste reduction, material substitution, and infrastructure development. And then in a really interesting and in some ways perverse development, the New South Wales government passed the Product Lifecycle Responsibility Act, which is one of the most ambitious product stewardship laws in Australia. Apparently, it mandates brand owners of designated products to take full life cycle responsibility from design through to post-consumer recovery, especially for items posing environmental or health risks. Quite how that's in a national interest is perhaps a conversation to be had on another day in another fora. But when it comes to what's left to be talked about and still unresolved at these negotiations, I think there are 5 things. The first is plastic production limits. Really, is there going to be a binding global cap, or are we going to see national discretion? That's the first question. The second is obviously the one of trade and feedstock control. Should the treaty regulate international trade in polymers, monomers, and fossil feedstocks or not? Thirdly, what's the enforcement mechanism going to be? Will the treaty actually be legally binding with compliance measures, or is it just going to rely on voluntary national plans? In terms of the issue of data, pardon me, the life cycle data and reporting issue is one that actually was kind of well resolved, but now is becoming even more uncertain. And the question of whether all parties will report standardised data on plastic production, flows and disposal. And then obviously the equity issue of will lower income countries receive financial and technical support and aid to comply with the treaty provisions. Now, before we jump to our august experts, what might happen? I came up with 3 treaty scenarios. The first I like to call treaty light, or most likely, which would be voluntary national action plans, no global cap on production, and yeah, some binding targets for downstream waste and recycling. A bit of a BAU plus a little bit. The possible, though, is the split treaty, the scenario B, where there are strong commitments on life cycle and phase out. There is no enforcement mechanism, but countries like the EU and the UK implement stricter national regimes, of which other countries that have subscribed or ascribed to the higher ambition would go in lockstep. The third scenario C, let's call it the breakthrough deal. It's definitely aspirational, where we do actually see agreement on soft caps and life cycle monitoring. We see legally binding toxic bans, potentially legally binding phase outs, and reporting, God forbid, with built in review cycles and a support, financial mechanism support for low income countries. So there you have it. Let's now move to our panel and really frame the question that from Nice to New South Wales, if I can use some really bad alliteration there, the landscape really is shifting quite fast. So if we now hear from our leaders that are working at the forefront of packaging business and science, as well as circular policy, how do you think we are preparing for that plastics treaty and what could we be doing now? And I might jump firstly to John to ask you to come in because you are the new speaker on the block, as it were, welcoming you to the conversation. And I guess one of those 60 minutes questions, if I can put it that way, please don't sue us because we don't have $16 million, which is what impact do you think the US opposition will have to caps on treaty ambition?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Morning, everyone. Um, I think maybe I'll just take one little step back there because I think that a lot of the treaty discussion, I think there's a lot of kind of confusion and has been actually almost at the start of the process around this issue of cap. When you're talking caps, we're talking production control
Yeah,
measures, capping how much plastic can be produced. And I think that, as much as many stakeholders would like to see something like that in the treaty, I think the large majority of stakeholders recognize that the treaty is not going to be the right mechanism to enable a cap on production in that way. There are ways that you can tackle production. You can add taxes, you can do a number of other mechanisms, but the hard cap is going to be very difficult. And if there were to be a treaty that kind of managed production, it would far more likely be something like the climate change convention rather than the plastics treaty. And there's lots of reasons for that because plastic is only one of the products that
yeah,
are produced from fossil fuels. So I think right from the start, there's been kind of, I would say, obfuscation around this point around caps and its importance. And I think most of the kind of significant stakeholders, although kind of recognizing the importance of addressing reduction as part of the treaty, I don't think that caps has ever been something that is legitimately going to be like on the table as an end outcome. And partly I think that there's been the people putting that on the table have been fear mongering, and often many of the oil producing states trying to say, well, this is why we must avoid the treaty altogether. But that's never really been what the treaty is about. So just wanted to start with that point, and I think it's important that we all understand that. I think the second point, some, somewhat similar in some ways, actually, because you asked about what is the US doing and the US's position, how does that influence us? The US has also been one of those states that has historically kind of challenged this issue of a cap and saying we don't want caps. And I think if you listen carefully enough, most people say, well, that's okay. We understand that we're not pushing for caps. Um, and I think that also the US's position in any treaty is they've very very rarely, if any,
no, no, do
if
anything
ever,
anyway. Yeah.
joined any of these international agreements anyway. So I think that broadly, I think most of the stakeholders, actually even perhaps more so now, recently after the heads of delegation meeting that took place towards the end of last month, where the US have now started to be a bit more outspoken in terms of their kind of lowering of ambition. I think perhaps with the new administration in place in the US, they're now starting to talk about kind of even lower ambition. But many of the states are not really that concerned about that because they recognize that the US is not going to join the treaty, and see that the kind of the US interventions now are really about just lowering ambition for everyone else, even if they're not going to join the party. So I think that the ambitious states are not concerned about the US's position, and even from my understanding, some of the more kind of the BRIC states that you mentioned, for example, have got ambition for some of these the key things like bans and phase out of the problematic plastics and chemicals and some of the kind of global product design obligations. They're open and interested to that. And so, the US's positioning around caps is actually not that critical to the discussion in my mind.
Okay. So what does the architecture and then the process look like, um, given that important disclaimer in relation to the role of caps? What does the what does it look like if there is some form of success out of the Geneva negotiations? Some are saying that it will look more like a Montreal Protocol rather than necessarily a Paris Agreement moment. Some say, and your reference to the US not being part of it lends itself to a conversation. Could this look like the UNCBD, for example, because the US are not a party to that particular treaty? Is there a sense of what the apparatus of the next phase of this would look like, whatever the outcome is? Or is that also up in the air and uncertain?
Yeah, I think they're somewhat uncertain some pieces of this, and we'll only really know when the gavel comes down at the end of the INC meeting. But I did just want to say around your kind of scenarios. I think the weak treaty is an option, and to me, a weak treaty is a treaty that has no obligations, that relies purely on voluntary action. I think we've seen over the last 30 to 40 years that national voluntary action alone doesn't solve the problem. The trend has continued to escalate. Many countries already have national action plans on plastic pollution,
Yeah.
and it ignores the fact that plastic pollution is a global pollutant, and it's traded globally, whether as a raw material or as a waste material. And having all these different sets of regulations to deal with this material in different places is part of why we have this huge kind of plastic pollution problem to start with. So I think that you can hear from my speech here, the kind of voluntary national action plans is not really going to solve anything.
Yeah.
I think the second option, which to me is really what we've been advocating for from the beginning, both as WWF and importantly as the kind of business coalition, where you've got almost 300 of these kind of some of the biggest multinational companies working in consumer goods packaging, all sitting there at this point in time, showing that they would like to see a treaty with global rules, and those global rules are around some of the key elements. There are going to be bans and phase outs of problematic plastics and chemicals, and I think that's quite clear why we need that. Some of the things like common product design rules. Again, because we live in this global world, you need to actually have everyone playing by the same rules, which massively increases the chances of recycled or product
Mm.
being recycled or reused. And then I think some tools like extended producer responsibility, we recognize that they are not. We don't want to have a global EPR scheme because I think that would be very difficult to administer and complex. But the requirement for a, any and all parties to the agreement to actually have some form of EPR put in place in their country, and ideally that EPR like following a set of kind of common principles.
Yeah.
Those type of elements. If we get a treaty which has even just those kind of, well, I suppose also to add in what you mentioned, I think finance is going to be critical. We can't put obligations on countries, particularly developing world countries, without providing some form of finance to support their kind of achieving that. But if we get those measures in place, I think that would be a real win, and that would be kind of the treaty that we need. Um, the other options, and there are quite a few, is I think there's the Treaty of the Willing, for example, where you've got we already know from the Nice wake up call there are 100 plus states who have a certain level of ambition, and they are being blocked from moving forward by a quite relatively small minority of states who won't let, don't want to come to an agreement.
Mm.
So that 100 plus states could, separate themselves and say, well, we'll agree to, these kind of binding rules between ourselves. And that is totally normal, and it's happened in many other treaty processes. And I think, that's what we should be oh, I don't know, the second best option in a sense, because getting 100 states and that can build over time is more impactful than having, a consensus rule whereby everyone's going to take the kind of lowest level of ambition. And then there are a few scenarios of, well, no treaty or further negotiation committee. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think there's kind of a few pieces that we don't know, and we will only know towards the end of the process in Geneva what kind of the future holds for us there.
Because Chris's internet's decided to freeze, because it is cold in Sydney, can I tell you? That I want to talk about the business role, because obviously the coalition is an important enabler in relation to bringing together, collaborating, and also championing a particular viewpoint in relation to the treaty negotiations. What's your observation thus far in relation to the private sector's willingness to see a strong, robust, long-term framework being put in place? And then I'll probably move over to Hannah as a result of that question as well. So, John, what's
Yeah,
your
thanks, Andrew.
observation so far?
I mean, to be honest, I was one of the original kind of people who worked on the business coalition or set up the business coalition, 3 or 4 years ago. And at the time, the logic was, if we as WF are going to be advocating for this ambitious treaty, but we're going to be, fighting tooth and nail against big business all the way along, it's going to be really difficult because, you've got to get it across the line with governments and businesses. And so we started to investigate with some of the companies that WF worked with at the time, say, like, what is it? What would this mean for you? And the more we looked at it together, the more I think all the companies recognize actually, we're facing this massive and growing kind of compliance challenge in all the different countries that we're working in. It's getting increasingly confusing and difficult for us to manage our operations, and even companies that weren't kind of multinationals, obviously they're importing feedstock from one place which is made to certain specifications which doesn't meet. And if you're exporting waste, all of these things. And so it was one of those kind of sweet spots where actually, business and the kind of civil society were aligned in saying, like, if we actually want to deal with this problem properly, from a business perspective, it's actually lower cost for us. If we get this right, we can increase recycled content, we can save on how much we're spending on compliance, all these things. And obviously, from a environmental perspective, it actually solves the problem that we started talking about the treaty in the beginning with. So I think I've been really encouraged by generally the kind of the business community's approach to the treaty. I think there's even the production sector. We do have some producers who are part of the business coalition who recognize that the future cannot be the same as the past. We need to address the kind of production challenge. We need to make sure that we've got kind of mechanisms in place that force everyone to think more about recycled content rather than just bringing more virgin onto the market, for example. And also, when you start forcing recycled content, you also start forcing, collection, for example, and reuse and all of those other things, which, previously have just been ignored. So I'm really optimistic about it. And I think one of the things that I also am really encouraged by is that, yes, the treaty is going to happen, in some shape or form, but I see the momentum that has been built by it, amongst civil society, businesses, and others. And I feel that, that momentum will not stop regardless necessarily of the outcome in Geneva.
Okay. All right. Hannah, let me bring you in and ask you, do you share those thoughts? And um, without giving away anything in terms of commercial advantage, has Colgate's position been strengthened, been encouraged, mollified as a result of the discussions that are coming up in the next less than 30 days? How does Colgate view where it's at this very moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the The first things to address is probably, yeah, I'm sat here as a American headquartered business.
Yes.
Obviously lots of change in that kind of landscape, but from our perspective, sustainability wise and specifically from a packaging perspective, our goals and our progress in this space hasn't changed. There's obviously lots of different views. Yes, there's changes in the American landscape, but we are that multinational. We're obviously present in the UK and many countries across Europe, if not all of them. So, we do need to balance all of those kind of requirements across our global supply chain and across all of those countries and what would be required and what kind of comes into place in relation to new regulations in terms of packaging. We had strong 2025 goals on packaging, as many businesses did. We still continue to push towards those. There are some challenging elements that everyone's experienced, but we continue to do what we can in the countdown towards the end of the year. And then as we kind of set our next kind of shorter midterm frame strategy to 2030, those goals on packaging specifically continue to evolve and they're not changing. We are looking to introduce more recycled content, continue to reduce our reliance on virgin plastic and do what we can in that space. So very much aligned to the business coalition. I guess we're one of those multinationals that John mentioned, and we're very much supportive in terms of the treaty and that kind of collaboration for more. We definitely need more kind of rules and those global rules internally to help drive a little bit more change and again continually push. We've got those 2030 goals, but push them a little bit further.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So let's go to the counterfactual just for one moment. Not that I want to necessarily acknowledge that it might happen, but to both of you, what is the next step should this fall over? What if there is no outcome from the August Geneva negotiations? Is there a 5.3, John? Is there a this goes back to each and every country, and there are further deliberations about how it might be returned, particularly as there's been, certainly in the last few weeks, this angst that the climate COP negotiations are suffering from implementation fatigue. And so there's just no appetite to be ambitious in any way, shape, or form from the perspective of country participation. That's certainly what's come out of the bond negotiations in the last few weeks. Does this suffer from the potential for the same outcome in the same way as the other negotiations for climate and, to a lesser extent, I guess, nature and the CCD might be also suffering? John.
Hannah, do you want to go first?
Yeah.
I'm happy to answer. If
All
you
right. Well,
want me
let,
to
let me
start.
let me do it this way. I will give you the thoughts of Chairman Andrew from an Australian perspective, and you can reflect. I think it's interesting that Australia did not abandon its high ambition coalition position uh, from administration to administration. So obviously, an election happened in the middle, and yet we saw our Environment Minister not only reaffirm the support of the High Ambition Coalition, but also signed on to the Nice Declaration. Regrettably, not having Chris here to talk about what's going on in the national circumstance around EPR, CDS, and the broader circularity agenda indicates that this country has. Oh, is he there? Are you there, Chris?
So I've had to come through the back door. So I'm actually
He is here.
apologies.
Well, then,
I had a meltdown
I'll bring
in
you
my
in and
IC.
ask you your thoughts on where you think Australia is up to at the moment in relation to the agenda, because you're right at the heart of it.
Yeah, and apologies. I've just missed the last 8 minutes or 10 minutes.
It was
Um,
profound and it was really exciting, and you'll just have to wait for the
I
recording.
I'll just have to wait for the recording. Apologies. Obviously, So I may be going over old ground. Just some headlines from me. Certainly, obviously, it was fantastic that Minister Watt came out strongly with a really proactive stance on the Global Plastics Treaty. Yes, High Ambition Coalition, a real focus on Australia's role in the Pacific and the importance of Australia sort of being taking a positive stance on plastic and its impact on the marine environments, again, especially across the Pacific. I think from a selfish perspective regarding packaging, obviously INC-5.2 is hopefully going to create a shift on how packaging and plastics are produced and used. You've got global standards. We're at the end of the supply chain, so the whole concept of global standards for packaging design are a good thing. Phasing out problematic plastics are a good thing, and expecting international agreements on certain targeting plastics and chemicals of concern. No news in that. Around PFAS and hard to recycle polymers. Certainly stronger producer responsibility frameworks and EPR, and this is a bit of a segue to what we're up to at the moment, again, is a good thing and helps set the scene. There is obviously also the potential for trade and import restrictions in the context of where EPR is at. For those not aware, we released a 2030 strategic plan in mid last year, circa 12 months ago, expecting that, and we're under the impression that the Commonwealth the federal government were going to release a very clear message on packaging regulation reform that, for a whole lot of reasons, hasn't come through yet. We've now got a new minister, albeit within the same government. We, back in March, took to our members a consultation paper on how that strategy was to be activated. A really key important part of that was the concept of an extended producer responsibility fee. That's really aimed at driving, giving APCO on behalf of its members the ability to intersect the downstream system. From a review of national packaging targets a couple of years ago, we identified that there are economic gaps in the system that are really constraining or restraining members' ability to secure a social license for their packaging. These are economic gaps that they need to be filled. If you've got packaging, plastic packaging in particular, soft plastics is a really good example. There's a lot of really well-intended work and effort by the likes of Soft Plastic Stewardship Australia and others to lean in. The challenge is somebody's got to have to pay for that. We tested that with our members, and yes, there's support for the concept of extended producer responsibility. Everybody wants it to be true. The issue is that in the absence of regulatory certainty, in the absence of free rider management, those two things are relying on governments being really clear with what's happening and or enforcing. In the absence of those two things, it's really hard for businesses at the moment to sign on to an EPR fee. With that in mind, and there were also a bucket of, you could argue, hygiene issues. Members wanted clarity and certainty around a few key things, like how would the scheme be governed, some of the operational pieces, some of the points of clarification for things like imported packaging, imported recycled content, that become quite fundamental depending on what your business type is. So we've gone on a real journey. We've got a lot of clarity around where members are at. We'll be releasing a roadmap moving forward for how we're actually responding to these things. And in the background, we're obviously working with government to get a lot more certainty around regulations. What will they look like? Minister Watt, from what we can, well, we're under the impression that Minister Watt is yet to be fully briefed on this. Obviously, he's been away in these discussions and has been giving every indication that the show goes on a bit like, as Peter, Andrew, you were just saying, that that has been continuation of Minister Plibersek's position on the treaty. We're just waiting for the details now on where he sits on packaging reform. I think as far as what brand owners could or should be doing while we're working through the roadmap and taking members on the journey and bringing them into, in some areas, co-designing or refining some of the key concepts that APCO's been working on for the last 12 or 18 months. In the background, some calls to action would be just don't let go of recycled content, don't let go of redesigning packaging to make it more recyclable, more recoverable. Certainly strengthen your data quality systems. The genie's well and truly out of the bottle. It's just a matter of time. As Australia aligns with global practices, and some of these things just take time, and the longer you leave it, the more expensive it's going to be to get your house in order.
Well, I wanted to pick up on that point about increased costs, because let's be honest, that the uncertainty associated with the trade, the tariffs that are being proposed by the Trump administration causes an uncertainty around feedstock and the cost of that feedstock going forward, surely. And the need for some certainty from that particular process to assist in understanding how a international treaty in relation to the regulation of the use of that feedstock for the purpose of ratcheting it down over time is going to be one of those difficult issues, of which the US obviously at this stage has indicated that they don't want to necessarily participate in. So that goes back to my question, Don. What's the feared counterfactual? What if there's no outcome? If my three scenarios are highly, what's the word? Pollyanna-like, and even the treaty light most likely doesn't even eventuate, and we just agree not to agree. What comes next as a result of that, if that is a scenario?
Yeah, so I think there's another thing that I always kind of try and emphasize, particularly talking to a group of stakeholders like Australia, is that I mean, listening to your introduction as well, the a number of different laws that you've already got in place and are kind of working within Australia probably puts you in the top, I don't know, 10% of the countries around the world in terms of how you're addressing the challenge. And in theory, the treaty, what is being proposed in terms of the global obligation, and the treaty should not be that scary to a country like Australia. I'm not familiar. I know you have a kind of a specific plastics pact, but most of the plastics pacts around the world have already got a list of problematic plastics identified, which they are in the process of kind of phasing out. And the idea of saying collectively these are materials that we don't want on our market is already happening in many different countries around the world. So, we're not, I think the list that is being proposed to the treaty is not this hugely, like a massive list which will kind of get rid of half the products on the market. So I think many countries are already well along this path. And I think there's already a certain amount of standardization taking place across these different countries, recognizing, yes, okay, stirrers are a problem. Sometimes, polystyrene, extended polystyrene is a problem, all of these kinds of things. And you'll see that, doesn't matter where you look, the things that we're trying to get rid of are pretty similar. So I think that trend will continue if we don't have a treaty which actually enforces it. But what we really need is that the bottom 40% of the world's countries actually get brought up rather than necessarily, the Australians and others having to add like even more onerous regulations on top of you through the treaty. I don't think that's going to happen. What we really want the treaty to do is drag those kind of really bottom states up so that they're at least kind of got some of these basic mechanisms in play. And you will always find that countries are going to some countries will be ahead. And again, by the sounds of it, I think a lot of what Australia has done already does put you ahead of what the treaty would be asking of many states. We see that already with the EU as well. So I think that if we don't get the treaty we want, you will continue to see a certain level of harmonization. It will be much slower. It will be more costly to businesses, yes, all of that. But we're still going to move in that direction. All of the kind of business initiatives are already trying to do that. Consumer Goods Forum have developed their kind of the golden design rules for packaging, where they're trying to bring this kind of common vision into being. So I think it is kind of going to happen anyway. It's just about how quickly and how much it's going to cost. And I think one of the things which is going to be really interesting, if you look at what's happened over the last even 5 years, something that has kind of changed quite significantly is the kind of research and concern around the issue around microplastics and their impact on human health. And that is going to continue to escalate rapidly. And I think you see the producers, are not really that concerned about it. Their biggest problem is they want to be able to, sell their products as much as they can.
Yeah.
Whereas the consumer goods companies are actually faced with the kind of, I think, the legal liability risk, and they're the kind of client-facing, customer-facing companies that don't want to be associated with any of these kind of human health issues. So there's going to be an increasing schism between the two. And if producers say we're not willing to address any of these things, and consumer brands are getting more and more threats and risks to their businesses, you're going to see this growing kind of divide between them. And I think that that's also going to lead to some interesting kind of discussions in the future.
Some interesting schisms, yeah. Let's work on the angel side of thing and assume that there is going to be an outcome, and it's a positive one, even if it's not a what did I call breakthrough deal. And Hannah, I wanted to, and also Chris wanted to ask questions about. So what does business do with a successful outcome from INC 5.2? What does a Colgate do with that? It obviously continues on what it's doing, but does it look at being more ambitious? Does it look at rethinking its opportunities for targets and performance? Does it ensure that there's going to be greater accountability? Just talking those points about John just mentioned of a potential schism of those who are reluctant to do other things, as is distinct from a Colgate Palmolive, which is kind of leading from a design point of view. What do you think? And in broad terms, because I'm not asking for commercial in confidence, but what does the glide path look like if there is a successful outcome from the negotiations for business?
Yeah, I think it definitely starts with, kind of reviewing our goals that are in place and checking kind of where they sit in terms of that ambition and that timing. I think the key part is probably the bringing internal stakeholders on board. To John's point around those kind of bottom 30 to 40% of countries, we have that global presence, and it's perhaps working to bring them up to speed, making sure that they're kind of performing at levels of that other countries are, where the likes of Australia and some European countries where there's been some kind of requirements for a little while, so bringing them up to speed. And I think that has the opportunity to have a really big impact on our kind of business progress on these goals as well. So that will probably be where we look. And then I think the other part would be across that global supply chain part, or probably more of the design process. We might be designing some products in China and sourcing from somewhere else in the world, and just kind of collectively bringing that together with a bit of a more robust set of goals and less kind of wiggle room. There's definitely many stakeholders, and if they don't have locally a requirement to deliver a certain form of packaging or a certain material reduction, they'll definitely push the boundaries for whatever the kind of commercial goal is, as opposed to prioritizing in the packaging requirements or plastic reductions. And hopefully, with that kind of positive outcome, it works to elevate those particular goals and bring them into a little bit of a higher ranking in the commercial order of goals to deliver a new product or a new pack design.
Okay, so I did hear three things, and now I'm trying to remember what they were. I heard stakeholder re-engagement. I heard building capacity, particularly within other markets where they have, perhaps taking John's point, are in the bottom 30 to 40%. And then there's also that regulatory coherence that ensures that free riders don't emerge and, in fact, are shutted out of a market that are not doing the right thing according to whatever is the outcome of this particular treaty. Bringing Chris back in, what does it mean for an APCO? And we've had this conversation, you and I, Chris. What does it mean for an APCO if there is an outcome that, as Hannah and John are talking about, perhaps is not breathtaking, but is maybe not groundbreaking, but is certainly a momentum building and or building block for the work that APCO is trying to achieve and is looking to transition in its 2030 plan?
I think it provides, as we've just heard, like for internal stakeholders within a lot of our members, there's genuine goodwill out there in business to do the right thing. It just may be that the trajectory is not necessarily as steep, and it's just going to take a little bit longer. But the messaging is, it's coming. You've got to stay true to the course. And in that sense, for APCO, we're certain sometimes you've got to go slow to go fast. And we're doing a bit of a reset to take our members on the journey around EPR fees. What do they look like? Taking this time to really get people's house in order. And it was actually fascinating that for all a number of members who were sort of saying, yeah, no, we get it, but we can't, we don't want to go hard on EPR fees today. For each one of those, we had a member turning around saying, listen, I need to be able to do, we've got the momentum, we've got to keep going. So for those that were saying delay, be cautious, be careful, there were also members saying, we've got to keep going, we've got to keep going. And certainly for APCO, we are a member-based organisation. It's suicide to just plough ahead just because. So we have to take the masses on the journey. And we also want to be able to use our position to help inform government and help influence government agenda. That's where, as per with Colgate, the whole concept of targets, in this instance for Australia on packaging, we've had a voluntary target, or a set of voluntary targets. There's certainly a big opportunity for government to tighten those targets and really move them from voluntary to mandatory. We know that that's coming. 2 years ago, environment ministers committed to mandated design standards. They've been slightly problematic, protracted. Governments realise how complicated that is in reality, but they are coming. So business to think that it's not possible, that's naive. And there's two elements to this. One is design standards for recyclability. The other is mandated recycled content requirements and expectations. 18 months ago or 12 months ago, we issued a fairly substantial piece of work, a discussion paper on recycled content, what it means for Australia and Australian businesses in the downstream system. So government's actually got a lot a lot of levers that they could pull, and we're certainly trying to work as a co-regulator, between the interest of industry and government to navigate environmental outcomes for all. And so it's certainly not doom and gloom at our end. Whatever flavour is the end result of this series, there's still a lot to be done, and I wouldn't miss the opportunity for it if I was in business.
No, you're absolutely right, and it will be a not insignificant moment, because in one sense, it's the first gathering of the international multilateral community for a few weeks now, since everything that has been going on in our world, and to see if there is a sense of multilateral outcomes that can be achieved, at least on this topic, which hopefully then lends itself to further success, not just at COP30, but certainly during the younger United Nations General Assembly process in September. John, you put your hand up. You don't need to put your hand up. You just yell at me. What would you like to share? And just before I do, conscious we've only got 7 minutes, but if there is a burning question from the studio audience, please put it into the Q&A. I will read it out, or you can send it via the chat function. More than happy to articulate any questions that the audience may have. John, what did you want to share with us?
I just wanted to build a little bit on what Chris was saying, actually. So recently we've just commissioned a study with systemic kind of consultancy looking at the kind of options of what a treaty with kind of global obligations versus business as usual versus a treaty with kind of weak obligations is. And it is quite interesting, I think, in terms of all of the outcomes that we're interested in, both from a environmental perspective, so reduction of mismanaged waste, for example, we have a 23% greater. I think we have overall about a 50% drop from no treaty, so business as usual, to having a treaty, but then an additional 23% reduction if we have global rules in terms of and when I say global rules, I'm just talking about those kind of phase out product design and kind of harmonized or standardized EPR processes. Perhaps most importantly and interestingly, we have a doubling of global EPR revenues. If every country has to implement EPR according to some form of harmonized principles, you start to really generate significant income. We're looking at, I think the study that showed, I think it's $576 billion of cumulative EPR revenue between 2026 and 2040, compared to almost half of that if we don't kind of have a harmonized global approach on EPR.
Really?
And
okay.
I can share I'll share a link with you in the chat now, actually, or where you can find all that information. But also importantly, things like recyclability. As soon as you start to force kind of particular product design and you remove problematic chemicals and products from the value chain, obviously you get massive increase in recyclability and reusability. And so, the indications are from this study that there's a 77% increase in recyclability of plastic. So, our argument is actually it's predominantly an economic one. That if you do start to harmonize these things, you also get investment because now investors know that the rules aren't going to change tomorrow, and that we are actually investing in recycling, and we're not going to be outdone by virgin plastic the day after tomorrow, kind of thing. So, I think what's quite exciting for me is the shift from the kind of concern just purely about the environmental issues, but I think, more and more, I think Chris was saying the same thing. As we advance down this road, it becomes very clearer and clearer that the economics don't make sense to have this kind of linear economy approach any longer.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and let's use that as the conclusion, because I think that's absolutely right. And we haven't, pardon me, sorry, it's getting over the flu. We haven't had any Q&A, so we've obviously done our job, the four of us. Snaps to all of us for giving a really good insight into what may happen in the, what is it, less than 30 days now? We haven't scheduled a what happened webinar, largely because we wanted to see what was going to happen. But I will definitely call out our expert speakers if there is something of note to be talked about, and we will no doubt share with you the opportunity to hear more about this. And we've extended an invitation to our dear colleagues at the Department of Climate Change to share more about what their thoughts are, and maybe they're willing to share those after the negotiations. But I guess let's give you back those 3 minutes in just before the hour. Thank you so much to John, to Hannah, and to Chris via phone for joining us in this webinar today. A copy of the recording will be available on our YouTube site, and the full analysis of the information that I provided up front will be provided to the members through our exclusive tracker that we provide in our weekly newsletter. So don't forget to review that. But for now, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to the audience. My name is Andrew Peterson, and looking forward to seeing you somewhere in the future. Bye for now.